Along the far northern border of Israel lies Mount Hermon. It is an exotic mountain, and it is the place where, according to ancient historical writings, the fallen angels came down before the flood and consorted with the daughters of men. Gary Stearman is here to discuss with me Mount Hermon, Gate of the Fallen Angels.
And JR, if you stand in northern Israel today and look to the northeast, you'll see snow-capped Mount Hermon. It's beautiful. 3 peaks, the tallest of which is 9,166 feet. But JR, there is an aura about Mount Hermon. There is a spiritual quality about it, and it is not a positive spiritual quality. In fact, its very name, Hermon, according to Jerome, translator of the Latin Vulgate Bible, means forbidden or accursed. It's thought of as a forbidden place. Why would this be so?
Isn't that amazing?
It is.
Genesis chapter 6 says, the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives, all which they chose. And of course the giants were born from them. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that. When the sons of God came into the daughters of men, they bare children to them, the same became mighty men, which were of old men of renown. These giants are really an incredible story here. But the important thing is, God said back in Genesis chapter 1 that the seed of the serpent would oppose the seed of the woman. Well, we know that the seed of the woman came through the Lord Jesus Christ of the tribe of Judah. According to Jacob in Genesis 49, Dan would produce the seed of the serpent. And Gary, Dan moved north to the foothills of Mount Hermon, and it appears that in his days, the angels, the fallen angels, came and consorted with Dan and inserted the seed of the serpent into the Danites, and from them, according to the rabbis, according to early church historians, Dan will produce the Antichrist. That's the theme of today's program. We're going to probe Mount Hermon.
Now, in the beginning, let's point out that the Jews have a lot of commentary concerning Mount Hermon. In their writings, which don't often get translated and read among Gentiles, we have a number of references to Mount Hermon. The Zohar, the Book of Radiance, a kind of spiritual history of the Jews. There is a very interesting reference to Mount Hermon, and JR, it seems to tie Mount Hermon very closely together with angels, even the fallen angels. And in an article which JR has written for the January Prophecy in the News called The Gate of the Fallen Angels, the Jews make a very good case for Mount Hermon as the entry point for the evil angels which descended to the earth.
Isn't that amazing? Go ahead and read just a little bit there from this Zohar.
The Zohar, which is as we say, a sort of spiritual history of Israel. We have a quote. Rabbi Jose says, following a tradition, that these Nephilim, that is the fallen angels, were Uzzah and Azazel, whom God deprived of their supernal sanctity. How, it may be asked, can they exist in this world? Rabbi Hiya answers that they were of a class of spirits referred to in the words, and birds which fly on the earth. Now that's back in Genesis 1:20, referring to men who can fly.
Isn't that amazing? So from that has come medieval paintings of angels, human-like people with bird wings. Now, of course, we know that can't fly. People with bird wings. It just isn't aerodynamically possible for such a thing.
Yes.
Gary should know his family built the Stearman aircraft. In fact, if you've been looking behind his head there on the shelf is a little model of the family project back in the early part of the 20th century. So Gary should know these angels with bird wings won't fly.
Well, the medieval picture of men with wings seems extremely unaerodynamic. However, if we go back to the ancient writings, and the Book of Enoch, Enoch describes what he called a house He says, I saw a house greater than the former. He had seen two of these. The second one he describes. An entire portal stood open before me. It was built on flames of fire. In every respect, it so excelled in splendor and magnificence and extent that I cannot describe to you its splendor and its extent. And its floor was of fire, and above it were lightnings and the paths of the stars. And its ceiling was also a flaming fire, and I looked and saw therein a lofty throne. Its appearance was as crystal, and the wheels thereof were as the shining sun. And there was a vision of the cherubim. And from underneath the throne came streams of flaming fire, so that I could not look thereon. You know, J.R., that a flying house suspended on flames of fire, that this sounds very technological to me.
So when Genesis 1:20 says, and birds which fly on the earth, there were some kind of something flying through the air.
Yes.
And according to the Book of Enoch, they descended and landed on top of Mount Hermon. So it became the spaceport or airport, whatever you want to call it, for these fallen angels, and they flew around in flying houses. Fascinating, isn't it?
Indeed, the port of entry, shall we say, of the fallen angels. Now, J.R., we must be quick to say that when we read and quote from the Book of Enoch, we're not quoting from Scripture, although Jude quoted from a portion of it.
Yes.
Nevertheless, it does substantiate a lot of very early history that's reflected in Genesis.
Now, the rabbis wrote, as Gary has mentioned, the Zohar. This is a copy of the Zohar, Volume 1, and this is just, for example, one of the statements, many statements here. Uzzah and Azazel, from them the mixed multitude derived their souls, and therefore they are called the Nephilim, because they fall into fornication with fair women. For thus God casts them out from the future world, that is from eternity, in which they have no portion, and gives them their reward in this world, as it is written, He repays His enemies to their faces, and so on and so on. So this, Gary, talks about the Nephilim, these fallen angels. Now, it's important to understand that they actually came to the earth, that they were flying around in ships of some kind, houses, flying houses, with fire or lights on them, and canopies and what have you, and portals where Enoch could enter. And so when they came down on Mount Hermon, they corrupted the human race. We are told in the book of Genesis that only Noah was perfect in his generations, which I think means that he was genetically pure and not contaminated by these fallen angels.
We need to read a couple of excerpts. If we've got your head spinning right now, listen to this. From the book of Enoch, and it came to pass after the children of men had increased in those days, beautiful and comely daughters were born to them, and the angels, the sons of the heavens, saw and lusted after them, and said one to another, Behold, we will choose for ourselves wives from among the children of men, and will beget for ourselves children. And they descended on Ardis, which is the summit of Mount Hermon. And they called it Mount Hermon because they had sworn on it and bound themselves mutually by a curse. There's the origin of the name, accursed, anathema.
From which we get the word Hermon.
Yes.
Well, according to an early scholar, this was November 21, 1881. George Shode wrote a general introduction to the Book of Enoch, and this is what he said. In the early literature of the church, there is a whole chain of evidences to this effect. Nearly all of the church leaders knew of an apocryphal Book of Enoch. Among them, the apostolic leaders was the Book of Enoch, refers to such a work. From that time to about the 7th century, Christian literature produces ample proof of the constant use and high standing of this book. He goes on to talk about Jude, quoting from chapter 1, verse 9, The Lord cometh with 10,000s of His saints. So the Book of Enoch, though it is classified apocryphal and not inspired writings, it is at least used and regarded by early church Christian leaders and rabbis. Let's talk about Azazel for a moment, Gary, because from what Enoch said, Azazel was, this Book of Enoch appeared to be at least well regarded by the rabbis and even by Moses himself.
Well, J.R., one of the fallen angels was called Azazel or Azazel, it would be pronounced in the Hebrew. And from the Book of Enoch 8:1 we read, "And Azazel taught men to make swords and knives and shields and breastplates, and made known to them the metals of the earth and the art of working them." And it goes on from there. Essentially, Azazel taught men to make war, the art of war. And for this he was accursed. And the curse was kind of fascinating. In the book, it says, "Thou seest what Azazel hath done, who hath taught all unrighteousness on earth." He was cursed. And the Lord said, this is again in Enoch 9:4, "And again the Lord said to Raphael, Bind Azazel hand and foot, and cast him into the darkness, and make an opening in the desert, which is Dudael, and cast him therein." Azazel is to be cast out into the desert as his punishment. Well, J.R., this Azazel is the name given to the scapegoat. That's fascinating.
Yes. The scapegoat on the Day of Atonement is sent out into the desert. Just as Enoch says, Azazel was taken out into the desert. And of course, he was thrown into Tartarus, a lowest part of hell. In fact, 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 and 5, Peter writes, "God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell, and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved unto judgment, and spared not the old world, but saved Noah." And Jude puts it this way. He says, "The angels which kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation, he hath reserved in everlasting chains under darkness, unto the judgment of the great day." These were Nephilim.
J.R., at this point, it's instructive to look at Deuteronomy, because this brings it all together. Deuteronomy 3, in which the conquest of Og is spoken of. Now, Og was a giant who lived in the land of Bashan. Bashan being today's Syria, right at the foot of Mount Hermon. And we read this in Deuteronomy 3:8, "And we took at that time of the land 2 kings of the Amorites, the land that was on this side Jordan, from the river of Arnon to Mount Hermon." Which Hermon the Sidonians call Sirion, and the Amorites call Shinir. "And all cities of the plain, and all Gilead, and all Bashan, unto Salca and Edrei, cities of the kingdom of Og in Bashan. For only Og, king of Bashan, remained of the remnant of the giants." These are the Rephaim.
Yes.
J.R., the giants were that monstrous crossbreed of angels and humans, and they were accursed. And you'll notice that Og lives in the shadow of Mount Hermon.
In fact, he ruled from Mount Hermon, the Bible says. And in Deuteronomy 3, verses 11 through 13, that area is called the land of giants. Now, the Rephaim are the offspring of the Nephilim, so don't get those two Hebrew words mixed up. And Gary, Genesis 6:4 says that not only did these giants be produced by the sons of God in those days, but he adds, and also after that. In other words, after the flood, more Nephilim came back to Mount Hermon. Now, Gary, the first group of 200 that Enoch talks about were thrown into Tartarus.
Yes.
And reserved into the great day of judgment. They couldn't come back. But it seems like we know that Satan has 1/3 of the angels of heaven on his side. So there are a lot more than any 200 evil angels. In fact, the whole world is filled with demonic activity today, I think. And we have... these 200 seem to be the scouts, the first group that came, and others came after them, came after the flood, and introduced the seed of the serpent into the human race.
They were the advanced guard, so to speak. And J.R., here's what's fascinating about all this. The curse that extends from Mount Hermon is centered right where we find enemy activity today. If you took an aerial view of Mount Hermon, it's right near Syria, It's right near Lebanon. It's overshadowing, if you will, northwestern Iraq. All of this evil activity seems to be focused right in this area that the Bible refers to as accursed, Hermon. Very near Mount Hermon today are a number of ancient places of idol worship. One of these is a very famous tourist spot called the Baalbek Acropolis. Baalbek from the name Baal, B-A-A-L-B-E-K, Baalbek. And J.R., the Baalbek Acropolis has been built in such a way that people wonder how it could possibly be built. The floor stones are the size of boxcars, in some cases 2 boxcars in length. They are of heroic proportions. And some people have said they must have been built by giants. Well, when we read in Judges 3:3, it says this, namely, the 5 lords of the Philistines and all the Canaanites, the Sidonians, and the Hivites that dwelt at in Mount Lebanon, from the Mount Baal Hermon unto the entering in of Hamath. So in Judges, the territory that was taken and if you will, regulated or ruled over by Israel, or at least should have been, goes under this name, Baal Hermon, or is sort of overseen by Baal Hermon. Now, that kind of ties it all together, J.R.
You know, Reginald C. Haupt Jr., some years ago, wrote a book entitled The Gods of the Lodge, and he went to Mount Hermon on a tour, and they found some 20 temples.
Wow.
In and around Mount Hermon, temples of Baal. You recall idolatry mentioned in the Bible? In the Ten Commandments, thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven images of gods above, and so on. Well, this worship of Baal and Ashtaroth literally centered around Mount Hermon. It was a Canaanite religion. And you know, the land of Canaan was called Canaan, not the promised land, even in the days of Abraham. Why? Because Ham and his children, which was Cush and Put and Mizraim and Canaan, migrated after the days of the Tower of Babel into this area and consorted with these angels from Mount Hermon. And then Canaan and his family settled in this area, and they developed a religion around this. Now Mizraim, a brother of Canaan, went on down into Egypt, and he found 3 other peaks. You know, Mount Hermon has 3 peaks. He found 3 other peaks in the form of great pyramids. And so he and his family stayed in that area and developed a religion around those pyramids. It became the mythology of Egypt. And then Phut and Cush went on further south into Ethiopia and into South Africa to populate there. But what is so interesting is those great pyramids seem to be with 3 peaks, or 3 of them there, huge, monstrous things. Seems to have been built before the flood, and they seem to have something to do with this worship around Mount Hermon.
And implying, of course, that the worship originated from above, and it was not a product of man's thinking, but was injected into humanity by fallen angels. Let me quote quickly from Reginald Haupt, because this brings our study from ancient history up through the time of Jesus and on into the present. Haupt said, "We then ascended to the mountain and found the ruined temple of Baal, constructed of Herodian masonry, which dated it to just previous to and during the early Christian era. In a low place near the northwest corner of the temple we excavated, found loads of ash and burnt bone, which had been dumped there as refuse from sacrifices." Now, this is the time of Jesus and the time of Herod, suggesting that even Herod and his people knew about this Baal worship on that mountain.
Now, Jesus and his disciples went up to Caesarea Philippi and stood there at the foot of Mount Hermon, where the waters of Dan come out from that cave,
yes,
which you can see in the picture we are supplying. And you see those little niches around? Those were niches for the worship of Pan, the god Pan. I think it's a takeoff from Dan, frankly. He was said to be the son of Hermes. Hermes, of course, is who the Romans called Mercury. He was the messenger of the gods. Well, hey, that's Mount Hermon. And those angels came down as messengers from the gods, shall we say, from Satan himself, and developed this seed of the serpent. The tribe of Dan moved there in the days of the judges, and at that point then, they disappeared from there to points unknown and became the proverbial lost tribe. And yet the rabbis have said that they will produce the Antichrist. In other words, these Nephilim consorted with the tribe of Dan and inserted the genetic reptilian serpent-like satanic seed into the Danites, and from them one day will come the Antichrist. So when Jesus stood there at the foot of Mount Hermon, he turned to his disciples and said, "Whom do men say that I am?" Yes. They said, "Thou art the Son of the living God." Now, I think Jesus was standing there in the territory he knew that the Antichrist would come from. And so he posed this incredible question, "Who am I?" The Son of God.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Wow. What an announcement.
Yeah.
Now let's move forward just a bit to a date that has very suspicious numbers in it. The numbers are 1666. In 1666, Louis XIV of France authorized the building of an observatory, and it bears on the location of Mount Hermon.
Yes, it happened to be in Paris, and so for a number of years, Paris had the zero meridian. Of course, the British wouldn't be outdone, and so a few years later, they set up a meridian called the zero meridian in London at an observatory called Greenwich. Greenwich. Now, in 1884, 25 countries met in Washington, D.C., and decided on a zero meridian for the whole world. And, of course, France abstained from that vote because it landed with the Greenwich Observatory in London, and that's where the zero meridian is today for all of navigation. But from the original Paris meridian, which goes back, days to Merovingian times,
yes,
Mount Hermon and the tribe of Dan lived 33 degrees east of the Paris zero meridian. Furthermore, Mount Hermon is 33 degrees north latitude from the equator. So we have this incredible 33rd degree that has come down to us in the Merovingian, Knights Templar,
yes,
secret societies, and it's all tied right back to Mount Hermon, isn't it?
33 degrees from Mount Hermon. Now, we're rapidly running out of time, but I want to get this in before we leave you today. JR has also included a study on the clothing that is so important back in the days of Nimrod and on down into the days of the Danites.
And of course, Nimrod wore leopard skins.
Leopard skins.
Well,
what does that have to do with anything?
Okay, Solomon,
skins.
in the Song of Solomon, talks about Mount Hermon as being the mountain of the leopards.
Aha!
Isn't that amazing?
That is.
Now, one important thing I want you to notice, that Nero, in his reign as king of the world, emperor of the mighty Roman Empire, changed the name of Caesarea Philippi to Neronius. Mount Hermon, where the gods came down, where Satan's crowd came down and introduced the seed of the serpent into the human race. I believe Nero knew of his ancestry and his roots, and he chose Mount Hermon to be, by his own name, Nero called it Neronius. That's amazing, Gary.
It is, and what it does is transfer the ancient leopard priesthood of idolatry down through the tribe of Dan. Jeremiah 8:16, the snorting of his horses was heard from Dan. The whole land trembled at the sound of the neighing of his strong ones. You know, we've talked about this verse before, but there from Dan, in the vicinity of Mount Hermon, we find the launching of the Antichrist.
Gary, it's been a good program.
JR, it has been, and this is only the beginning. You wait until you see what we have next.
This is JR Church and Gary Stearman. Until next time, keep looking up.